the closing plenary of the Platypus Affiliated Society International Convention, our fourth annual. And our tradition is to have a closing plenary each year that's really on platypus as a project. And we've done it a little bit differently each year that we've done this. The first year that we had a convention, it was the platypus synthesis. And the last 2 years, it's been 3 generations of platypus. That was the second year. And last year, what is the Platypus Critique? So the theme for this year, what we decided upon, why I joined Platypus, was something of a modification of the 3 generations of platypus, which we did 2 years ago at our second convention. So the idea would be, this is what I was tasked by the OrdCom to do, to curate a discussion and also participate in a discussion with members who joined Platypus in the last year, either right before or subsequent to the last convention, in order to sort of grasp the kind of different backgrounds, different experiences, different approaches to platypus as a project that our membership embodies. So I'm going to speak, then Teo will speak, then Ben, and then Doug. And basically, I suppose it's in seniority order in terms of history on the left and age. Sort of works out that way. So, all right, people are just arriving now. I'll begin with my remarks. Why I joined Platypus. So I'm going to narrate for you guys a little bit briefly, of course, which it could be, I could go on at great length about this. My own history on the left, going back to the 1980s. And part of the idea of this panel is to talk about decades of experience on the left, namely what it means to be vintage 1980s left, vintage 1990s left, vintage 2000s left, and in a sense now we're in the second decade of the 21st century, so now we can talk about the 20-teens, although not quite yet until next year. Are we actually in the teen years? So I want to say a little bit about my background in the 1980s. In other words, becoming a leftist as an adolescent, really in high school or even before high school. And I have a very common story in terms of Marxism, namely that my introduction to Marxism was reading the Communist Manifesto, which I did at the goading of a close friend of mine. His older sister was trying to corrupt her younger brother, and said, you guys should read the Communist Manifesto. And of course it worked. Namely, it worked in a way perhaps unusual and unintended, which was that I was struck by Marx's distinction between kind of progressive emancipatory and conservative reactionary responses to capitalism. In other words, one of the things that really struck me about that text was when Marx goes through the various forms of socialism prior to 1847, 1848, and makes a distinction between, in that term, reactionary socialism, really sort of seared into my mind. And this was the 1980s, right? So this was the Reagan era, and also very proximal to, still in the shadow of, and largely as a virtue of my parents, the post-Vietnam era, meaning a lot of the popular culture was very much concerned with the hangover from the 60s and 70s New Left, and specifically the sort of Vietnam War as a kind of trauma. And my early activism bore out a lot of this, namely the earliest activism I got involved with was Central American solidarity and South African solidarity, and dealing with exiles, people living in exile from South Africa and living in exile from El Salvador in particular, but from Central America, living in the New York area, and meeting, essentially cadre of the African National Congress, cadre of the South African Communist Party, cadre of the FMLN, the guerrilla force in El Salvador. And it was in the context of non-Marxist leftism, namely Catholic liberation theology. It was also in the context of Quakerism, sort of pacifism. It was also in the context of kind of ethical humanism, atheism. You guys know about this. And it was on Long Island. It was, but I grew up very close to New York City, and so once I got to be a certain age, I was able to participate in other leftist activity in New York City, and specifically, going into the city for marches and demos, and encountering the Marxist left for the first time in the form of newspapers and whatnot. Socialist Worker, Revolutionary Worker, which was the RCP USA's newspaper at that time before they just became Revolution. And even the Spartacus League Workers' Vanguard, I dug up in my old junk from my high school years. There's a copy of Workers' Vanguard that I picked up at some demo. And also going to various leftist bookstores in Manhattan, one of which was the Anarchist bookstore. And that's a funny little story that I'd like to tell. So my friends and I, we were in search of the Marxists. Where are the Marxists? Right? We want the Marxists. So going to the Anarchist bookstore, because of course we don't know the difference really between Marxism and anarchism all that much. And so I happened to meet a character who was mentioned at one of the workshops, I think it must have been Saturday morning, Murray Bookchin, right? That's a very important American anarchist. Namely, my friends and I went into the Anarchist bookstore and we said, "Do you have anything on Marxism?" And then this cranky guy comes out from the back. "So you're interested in Marxism, huh?" And he kind of gave me the "listen, Marxist" speech. Like, "Listen, Marxist. It's dinosaurs. You gotta get with it. It's post-scarcity socialism is what we need now." Anyway, this period expired rather quickly, and I went away to college, and I chose to go to a leftist college, not a university, leftist college, rather than to an elite college or an elite university. I had my choice of Columbia University, Williams College, Amherst College, or Hampshire College. Those were the schools I applied to. And of course, my parents will never forgive my choice to go to Hampshire College instead of these other schools, which were much more elite and prestigious and would have helped me get a better job in their mind. So I went to Hampshire College because I was interested in studying with leftists and pursuing Marxism, at least to some degree. It was at Hampshire, and I wish Richard were here. Richard's a number of years older than me. Richard and I met at Hampshire College, and I entered Hampshire College in 1988, which means that in my second year of college is when the Berlin Wall fell. And in my third year of college was when the original Gulf War, after the Iraq invasion of Kuwait took place. And it was in that context that I met and got to know the Spartacus League. And it's a kind of a funny story. I actually met them in my first year of college because a friend of ours, a high school friend of mine, and I went to college together. And a mutual friend of ours who we met there, she was in contact with the Spartacus, and she said that they had set up a meeting to chat with her, and she wanted us to come with her because, well, you guys are Marxists, so I want to hear your opinion of these guys and tell me whether you think they're full of shit or not. As it turned out, we were much more sort of interested after the meeting. We ended up being more interested in the Spartacus League than Beth was. And my friend who I went to college with from high school, he ended up doing an internship in Boston that summer, and he ended up working with the Spartacists the first summer after our first year in college. I got involved with them later, but he spent a summer doing work with them in Boston. And what was the attraction of the Spartacus League? What was the attraction of the Spartacus League? What we liked about the Spartacus League was that they didn't ignore the rest of the left. In other words, reading their newspaper, you got a sense that there were all these various left groups with all these different opinions, all these different approaches, and all of these various histories. Right, the left was comprised of various histories, a very complicated sort of melange of historical narratives. Nonetheless, the Spartacists hated all of them, and hated them in detail, and went into it, like they had their August 4th moment. Tony Cliff had his August 4th moment during the Korean War, right? Because they narrated in great detail when every what they called pseudo-left group, which is a great term, by the way. Every pseudo-left group, when they betrayed, Marxism betrayed the left. Like they were keeping the books on the left. And this was extremely fascinating, interesting. It motivated my and my friends' reading of history of the left. Sort of compelling account of all of these extreme minutiae details of the history of the left, which we found really fascinating and really interesting, and also just educational. So I organized in college, I had two organizing experiences in college. One was organizing the Spartacus Youth Club at Hampshire College, which I got, a bunch of us together. We were probably the largest Spartacus youth club that the Spartacus League had since the 1970s. We had 7 members, at our college, and this is in the 5-college area, so we were able to go to left events at the other colleges, especially UMass Amherst. And I also had another sort of sideline organizing career, and that was as an organizer of the gay students at Hampshire College, and that's because when my friend and I from high school, we were boyfriends in high school, went to college, soon broke up. But when we arrived at Hampshire, we were like, there's no gay student organization? What's going on? Because we had done some sort of gay community center kind of gay liberation leftism, very steeped in identity politics, which we were disgusted by. But anyway, in New York City, in Manhattan, at the same time that we were going to demos on to try to keep the U.S. from intervening in Latin America. And I also, we decided to take it upon ourselves to restart the gay organization at Hampshire College. And in the context of that, some of you guys would know these two figures, one of whom teaches here at the Art Institute by chance. We ended up hosting a couple of speakers on AIDS activism at Hampshire, namely Douglas Crimp, who's an important postmodern art critic from the October Group, and Greg Bordowitz, who teaches here and who's a sort of video artist and AIDS activist and did a lot of sort of video artwork that had to do with AIDS activism and ACT UP. And we were charged then with taking one of the campus vehicles and picking them up at the train station. And our conversation from picking them up at the train station back to the college was all about leftism and activism and Marxism. And they were shocked and disgusted by the fact that we were Marxists. They were like, Marxism? What the hell are you talking about? You want revolution? What do you think, that throwing bombs is going to solve something? Right, so we got this kind of postmodern, anti-Marxist sort of screed. So by the time we brought them to the college and had the event, we were already through with them, with the two of them. And we were happy to drop them back off at the train station later and be done with them. Little did I know that they were important people in other respects that I'd have to deal with. Okay, and Richard is here finally. So I want to say something then about this moment that Richard and I were involved with the Spartacus League at Hampshire, namely the combination of the fall of the Berlin Wall, the Gulf War that took place, because this is when I became a member of the Spartacus Youth Club and started organizing people into a Spartacus Youth Club.
It's the moment at which it was formed.
Right. And that Richard was in and out very briefly because
I was
Richard,
too lazy to sell the paper.
Too lazy to sell the paper, but also Richard is an inveterate Menshevik. Right, so he's our resident Menshevik, everybody needs one. So he was in, I don't know, what do you claim, a few months, a few days, a few hours?
I think it was in days.
Days? No, you were in for a few months.
No, not really.
Not really? Okay. Well, anyway, I was in it for 2.5 years. And I can trace my history with the Spartacus League from basically 2 dates. Fall of the Berlin Wall is the start date. Along the way, the Gulf War. End was the LA riots. The LA riots. Which was followed thereafter by the...
This was your identification with Rodney King?
Not exactly. Not exactly. And the election of Bill Clinton was around this time as well. And so this was what sort of depoliticized me. In other words, what politicized me in the 80s was this anti-imperialist activism, anti-apartheid activism, anti-US intervention in Central America activism. What sort of crystallized my consciousness around the history of Marxism, especially the history of Marxism in the 20th century, was my encounter with the Spartacus League around the time of the fall of the Berlin Wall, which then allowed me to experience anti-war activism through a new framework. In other words, I went to demos around the Gulf War in the same way that I went to demos previously, before I encountered the Spartacus League, but I had this sort of other frame for dealing with it. And then I became depoliticized really by 2 events. One was the LA riots, and the other was the election of Bill Clinton. And I felt that those 2 events told me that Marxism wasn't going to happen. Right? In other words, what was going to happen was riots and Democrats. And maybe you guys don't appreciate what it's like to live under 12 years of Republicans. Right? In other words, two terms of Reagan and 1 term of George Herbert Walker Bush. After 12 years, right, when Bill Clinton was elected, and everyone knew that he was a right-wing candidate in terms of the Democrats, but it was literally euphoric. Like, people at Hampshire were dancing all night in the quads and just carrying on in this unbelievable way, and all my Marxist professors, they were so happy. And it was quite incredible. And so that told me, okay, Marxism is not going to happen. And I shifted gears for myself into making art. I had a background as a writer of poetry, and I switched into video art in my last couple of years at Hampshire, and did an extra year there in order to sort of round out that concentration, and pursued a short career as a video artist. Ended up traveling to South Africa because of a film festival there and meeting all these figures that I had only heard about. And because they were proud, this is after apartheid, proud to host a gay and lesbian film festival. This is a sort of ANC kind of, they had the first constitution in the world that protected rights of homosexuals. I did that for a little while. I came here to the School of the Art Institute to do a Master of Fine Arts, and I entered a department that no longer exists here, namely the video department. It's since been folded into the film and video and new media department. And that department was staffed with Marxists, quote-unquote Marxists, who hated my video artwork because they thought it was too aesthetic. And Chris, why are you making art? They had this kind of Brechtian kind of notion that what you should do is sort of deconstructive.
Didn't they also think it was racist?
Well, they thought all sorts of things about it. But the identity politics was bad. But the Marxism, you know, the Brechtian kind of influence was really awful. And that drove me to read Adorno, because a friend of mine said, oh, you know, you're getting this crap from all these Marxists, you should read Adorno. And I read Adorno and was sort of fascinated again, and Adorno made perfect sense to me given my Marxist background, given the Spartacist background, actually. Adorno made perfect sense to me in terms of everything implicit in Adorno, all of the assumptions there, including assumptions he took from Trotsky's Literature and Revolution about the nature of politics and art, and the non-prescriptive character of Marxism towards art, etc. And took a different turn, because then I realized, oh, you know, Adorno is this character, and I can really dig him, and other people seem not to be able to quite get him, and so I decided, okay, I have to go get a PhD on Adorno, and set to write all of this bad reading of Adorno that's taken place in the world because of anti-Marxism, essentially. I had to sort of set right all this anti-Marxist reading and misunderstanding of Adorno, and went to the University of Chicago, and that's a whole other story. And I met the scholar of Marx who teaches there, Moïse Postone, who I had been warned from my high school friend, who was the one who put the Communist Manifesto in my hand, had gone straight through, done undergrad and graduate at the University of Chicago, and we ended up intersecting there. He was finishing up his PhD, and I had, you know, done this other career as a video artist, taken time off, gotten an MFA, so I was coming in when he was finishing up. And he said, well, there's this Moïse Postone character, but you know, he's pretty anti-Marxist. I was like, what do you mean he's a Marx scholar? Oh, well, you'll see. And had sort of warned me about Moïse. And nonetheless, I started studying with Moïse and you know, informed him of my background as a Trotskyist. And Moïse decided that he was going to take me under his wing and cure me of all of that. And also show me why Adorno was a Marxist, but why Adorno was also mistaken, because he was too much of a traditional Marxist, et cetera, et cetera. And when I did my qualifying exams and got ready to start writing my dissertation, I started teaching both at the university and then back here at the School of the Art Institute. And I taught Marx under Moïse as my supervisor when I teach at the University of Chicago, and Marx and Freud, sort of a year-long sequence. And here, the first class that I taught here was on Adorno. And when I was first teaching my Adorno course here, it was soon after the U.S. invasion of Iraq. It was during the sort of explosion of the anti-war movement. And a lot of my students in that first class were very much interested in the fact that I had this hyper-Marxist approach to Adorno. They were fascinated by this, and they wanted to know what it all meant.
This was what year, Chris?
2004.
That's the class with Ian, too.
Huh?
Is that where Ian did it?
Yeah, yeah, and also Eric. Yeah. You know, they were fascinated by this, and I started getting sort of colleagues and friends at the University of Chicago around this time, maybe leading up to this time. And Richard and I guess I should say that about this, Richard and I had fallen out of touch, and then we had ended up both in Chicago completely by coincidence, completely by accident, and we ended up reconnecting. This was back in the 90s, this was before I went to the University of Chicago, and we had talked about trying to form some splinter Spartacist group that we could do the Spartacist League better than the Spartacist League themselves did, right? We had this idea because we felt that the Spartacist League sort of shot themselves in the
Chris
foot.
was going to call it the Lebanon League.
Yeah, after Eugene Levinet, who was the leader of the Munich Council Republic, at the end of its history, he was a member of Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht's Spartacus Fund. And so we were going to call it the Levinet League to indicate the hopelessness of it all. But of course it never happened, right? This was sort of idle talk between me and Richard during these years. And what happened was I met various students of Moishe Postone, who you guys, of course, know, namely Spencer and Athia and Sunit, who I introduced to Trotskyism. I corrupted their minds. I introduced them to Trotskyism. And around the time that I started teaching, and around the time of 2004, the anti-war movement, we started talking about doing a journal project. And Richard coined our name, Platypus. He came up with this name from the Engels anecdote. And we thought about starting a journal project, and we got in earnest about the journal project after George W. Bush was reelected in fall of 2004. Because we were really disgusted by the anti-war movement. We were really disgusted again by what the Democrats did in the election, that they tried to run an even more pro-war kind of candidacy with Kerry, the Swift boat, with his Vietnam veteran status, et cetera, et cetera. And, but it didn't really go very far. We had a meeting, and my colleagues and I said, okay, we should write an editorial statement of purpose, and Chris, you write it, and then you can circulate it among us, and we can adjust it, improve it. So I was commissioned by the bunch of us to do that, but I never did it. Right? I didn't do it until 2006. 2006 was when the anti-war movement was still going on, and a certain kind of head was reached among my students here at the Art Institute, where they wanted to start an extracurricular reading group. Two of my graduate students wanted to start an extracurricular reading group and asked me to do it. And I warned them that it would get very political very quick, and that it would be, quite a serious endeavor, and they were very excited by this. I said, well, be careful what you wish for. And we started, I think that among the first things that we read was Karl Korsch's Marxism and Philosophy, which is a kind of a key text for us in Platypus. And this reading group mostly was graduate students from the University of Chicago, as well as the participating from the Art Institute were a couple of grad students from here, a few, in fact, grad students from here, Richard, and other people. For a couple of months we carried on like that. And then at the end of that semester, that spring semester,
You forgot to mention our youth contingent.
well, that's, oh, yeah, we had well, he came in later anyway. We had, at the end of the spring semester, once the school year kind of ended, then I felt free of ethical compunction, and the undergraduates that I had who were also interested got involved, because I felt like I was navigating the conflict of interest of being an academic teacher and doing this extracurricular reading group. And that year, that summer was really decisive then. It was the summer that the reading group really took off, and where we came up with a more rigorous syllabus. And Spencer and Sunit were not here for that. They were in London. They were in London, and they were doing research in London. And they were about to go to the SWP UK's Marxism conference, the Festival of Resistance. And they were sort of horrified by the cast of characters, the speakers on the roster. And they, contacted me and they said, Chris, where's the editorial statement of purpose for Platypus that we asked you to write a year and a half ago? What's the status of that? Because we really need something. We need to intervene here. We need to get something going. And so I wrote it then and circulated it among us. And that's the What is a Platypus? Surviving the Extinction of the Left. And then Richard said, well, you drop these dates and names in there. They really need explanation. And so then I wrote the Short History of the Left, which we also kind of circulated and corrected and sort of modified as needed.
Also, just part of the inspiration for the first reading group was I had, in Myopic Books, which is a good bookstore in the neighborhood I was then living in, Wicker Park, I found a copy of The New Left Reader, this old beat-up paperback.
Carl Oglesby,
which became the basis for a text for our reading. And I said, I looked at it and I said to Chris, this would make a great basic syllabus, because it just brings together like
All the symptomology.
all the symptomology of the New Left in one book published in
One volume.
1969.
Right, that was the first syllabus that we did. We kind of worked through those readings, which it was fascinating. It's Kolakowski, it's Althusser, it's Malcolm X, it's
Mark
Fidel
Rudd.
Castro, it's Mark Rudd. It's all of these figures, and also others. Stuart Hall and the others, yeah, and Rudy Duchka and Daniel Cohn-Bendit. Yeah, it's vintage. And we soon reached a kind of a crossroads that summer when I distributed this syllabus for us to continue our readings through the summer and into the fall. And I attached to the syllabus the What is a Platypus and Short History of the Left statements. And this caused a little bit of a controversy, and I want to just talk about that before I wrap up now. A couple of the people who were involved in the reading group at first were University of Chicago, either graduate students or postgraduates, and these are, one is John Abramite, who was a friend of mine, who had studied at University of California, Berkeley, with Martin Jay, and did a dissertation on Horkheimer. And so we met at the University of Chicago. It was kind of like, you know, oh, you're Adorno? I'm Horkheimer. It was like that kind of a meeting. Like, Adorno, I presume. Oh, Horkheimer, I presume. And we had gotten to know each other, and he was involved in the reading group. John had spent a number of years in Germany, just working and living there, actually before he went to graduate school in the 90s, and learning German, of course, but also getting exposure to what I would call the Council Communist left, the kind of the sort of German far left, the kind of Luxemburgist left in Germany. And we'd had a lot of conversations about Lenin and Luxemburg, Trotskyism, and all this stuff. So that was one person who was involved. And also Parker Everett, who's a younger student of Moishe Postone at the University of Chicago, who also had a leftist background, I think, at Wesleyan, where he did his undergrad. And so they were involved in the reading group, and they sort of jumped ship that summer when we came to a discussion of the Russian Revolution on the occasion of Althusser's Contradiction and Overdetermination essay in the New Left Reader. And John brought up Kronstadt, and Parker brought up Moishe's Critique of Traditional Marxism. But the thing that I wanted to sort of highlight, because John left because of anti-Leninism, and Parker left, we had a conversation that is specifically on point. Namely, Parker said, okay, you're starting this, you're getting this reading group going, and, he understood that it was going to be more than a reading group. He understood that it was going to be this project. And he said, well, Chris, I don't know if I can really do this because it's all newbies, right? It's like, look at all these like undergraduate kids you have here, and he's like, I can't learn anything from these people, right? These people don't know anything. They don't know anything. And so, I don't feel like this is going to be a really good experience because you're just dealing with newbies, and the conversation can't go very far dealing with people who are ignorant, inexperienced, too young, etc. Parker's like 10 years younger than me, but anyway, still older than the undergraduates in Platypus at the time, and he had this kind of contempt. Like, what are you going to do with these newbies? All you're going to be able to do, right, is have them blindly follow you. You're not going to be able to learn anything.
You said yes.
Yourself from working with these people, that we should be dealing with specifically people who are older, and what he meant was the 60s generation. And I took this criticism seriously. I took it to heart. But I realized that A, didn't want to deal with the 60s generation, and B, didn't really want to deal with people of my generation either. Right? Didn't really want to deal with people of my generation either. That rather, I was interested in what Marxism would look like to people who are younger than me. In other words, what would Marxism be? What would this experience that I've had be through the eyes of younger people? In other words, I had read all these things. I had read, Korsch, read Lukács, I'd read Marx, I'd read Lenin in my day, but it seemed like Adorno resonated with my students. But I wondered, how would this other stuff that was my kind of bedrock background in Marxism, what would that look like, really, to young people, and what would it mean to them? And I felt that, my experience, this is something that I'll talk about later, actually, in the organizational meeting that we'll have this afternoon. My experience of being a young teacher was that I only really learned what I knew about the stuff. I only really learned Adorno, finally, by teaching it. And teaching it for a little while, meaning I had already been teaching Adorno and Benjamin for a couple of years, for a number of years, by the time Platypus really got started as this reading group. And what I learned was that I learned a lot more in my first few years of teaching than I had learned as a graduate student, as a smart reader on my own, that really I only learned by teaching. And that I wanted to teach what I knew from Marxism because I wanted to know what it really meant. I wanted to know, I wanted to really learn it in a way that I couldn't have before. Right? In other words, I wanted to learn from my students in a way that I could never learn as a student, nor learn on my own. Right? And, again, that conversation with Parker has always haunted me because my feeling with Parker was that he missed a great opportunity, actually. That he missed a great opportunity to be, a pedagogue in Platypus. In other words, to really find out the stakes of Marxism by trying to teach it rather than being a perpetual student. He was a little bit too young to know that at the time, and probably still is. Still has a sycophantic attitude towards his elders. Doesn't realize the break that's necessary. But anyway, that's when I really joined Platypus. In other words, it was on that crossroads of, okay, Chris, what are you going to do? Are you going to go with your students? Are you going to deal with just newbies, right? Or are you going to, learn from your elders? And I made a choice, and it was that choice, actually. It was at that point, even though we had this journal project idea, even though I had written these statements for that project, it was that choice. That's when I joined Platypus, and also why I joined Platypus. All right, so, Teo.
Thanks. Okay, asking why I joined necessarily involves some kind of history, my background. It's not that there is a rational evolution or something. I cannot make it coherent or something, and maybe this could be a problem of rational as forcingly making it rational. When dusk falls, this is how you say it. Not only owls fly, but maybe platypus are around. So, yeah, it's not something reasonable, necessary. But I will just try to share some things of my background. First, I would like to speak about the present a bit. The Greek crisis, like the global crisis, is real. Because there are these theories that supposedly the crisis is just an excuse that some politicians have created in order to pass some laws. Well, I don't think this is the case. This was a real crisis that hit in 2007, and it hit Greece in 2009. It was funny because in 2007, people in Greece would say that, oh, we're lucky that our banks are not that big, and they have not bought that toxic products, so we will get away with it, and everything is fine. And then in 2 years, it has transformed in a debt crisis, and it hit very strongly. I'm telling this because this crisis really made me think a lot about my political position and politics in general. I mean, there was a crisis in Greece, and there were dilemmas posed. Like, okay, what you're doing now? And there was no choice that would seem emancipatory or good. I mean, immediately there was the issue with the austerity measures. And of course, austerity measures was and is a catastrophe for the people, economically, but also on other levels. But the anti-austerity politics seemed also horrible. I mean, denying the austerity program would mean to accelerate the crisis, deepening the crisis. But were we ready for this, in any sense? How wouldn't that lead to something more reactionary? And the perspectives, because of the lack of any serious left, and I mean that no one on the left was and is in Greece an important factor that can change things, that her decisions are important in the development of the events. So any surprise and deepening of the crisis would be right-wing, I think. So it was like an impasse for me. Like before the crisis, I had all these nice solutions, but now it was serious. It was, in my house. It was a serious problem. So I had to rethink what politics is and what emancipation is, what are my preconceptions of capitalism and all that. Now let me just turn back for a while, and when I got politicized, it was the end of the 90s, my first year as a student. It was the same year with Seattle protests, and I got away from the atmosphere of my house, went to Thessaloniki, which is a big city, northern Greece, and before that, I wasn't really involved in anything. I was just, didn't care about such stuff. But then immediately in the big city, my experience dragged me into politics, and I started to searching for possible expressions for this new interest I had. And the situation was that the mainstream left was either too much of old style Stalinist left, or either too reformist as a left. So I started searching extra parliamentary or more alternative political projects. I had a problem with the anarchists because I thought that they were not serious. They were just, dragged by daily events on what they were doing. And the Marxists, they had these big books, and they seemed more serious. So I went to the library, starting reading Capital and, all that stuff. But, it had to be contemporary, not just in the library. So I started searching for groups of Marxists and reading some newspapers. And I ended up with being an influence, as they were putting it, not a member, but someone who's likely to be a member of a Maoist group, who were very serious because they had this theoretical framework. They were producing essays and books on Marxism and the history of Marxism. So this is why I was attracted to them. But then it was Seattle. And there was this heat of the moment, and they could just not fit into this. Their analysis of the present was in the terms of the past, they could only be submissive to it because it wasn't the Cultural Revolution, it wasn't the Bolshevik Revolution. They had some frozen concepts of what is politics and revolution. And they only opportunistically would participate in current events just to recruit people. So I didn't like that. I didn't like their Stalinism and Maoism in the end. And they made me to go to the opposite direction. I felt that Marxism was something of the past, and now Marxism is not contemporary. Those people, the anti-authoritarians, are really feeling what they're doing, are really into this. And this is our historical moment after 1989 and all that. Marxism can only be lame now, this moment. So if you want to help the people, if you want to help people who suffer in the world or something, maybe you should go to the other direction, the anti-authoritarian movement, which was gaining importance with this, after Seattle, with all these, summit, anti-summit meetings. And even left groups were just tailing these events. They were changing their character just because of these events. The impact was huge in Greece. So I started reading Castoriadis, who is a Greek thinker, but he became what he became because he went to France as very young, and this is why he became this big philosopher. And he basically, his work is anti-Marxist and anti-Leninist. But this wasn't political, it was more theoretical. So I got involved in various projects, loose anti-authoritarian projects. Crazy things that I won't mention now, from abolishing schooling to squatting and whatever. And
why abolishing schooling?
Because it's oppressive, the curriculum is oppressive. It's predetermined for the people, while the people should freely decide what they want to learn, and this is knowledge. Some anti-authoritarian perspective on knowledge, and maybe Ivan Illich was an influence. He was mainly a liberal, so we had to marry him with anarchism or something. Okay, so then I thought that it should be more serious. I mean, we should have a project with aims and analysis and transitional strategy. So I got involved in this inclusive democracy project. I believe it was around 2003, after my last fightings and in the anti-EU summit 2003 in Thessaloniki. So I became a member in this group, which was more formal and more serious, and it had answers to questions, not loose, but on a global level. Then, after 3 or 4 years, I'm wrapping it up. I cannot describe with details everything. The thing is that from my Marxist background, there was the shadow of the Frankfurt School still with me. Like I wanted, I was still reading and I liked the material, but I was like, how did they still remain Marxists? I mean, it's so good reading it, but Marxist. So this paradox was accompanying my anti-authoritarian evolution, so to speak. So yeah, Adorno was a shadow on all this. Then I was, I hated postmodernism and stuff, and this inclusive democracy project was too Castoriadian, too many axiomatic subjective choices involved in it, and no serious consideration of objective historical factors. So then I found Bookchin. So it was in the same anti-authoritarian perspective, but more Hegelian and, more influenced by this perspective. But the politics was the same, essentially. So like small groups trying to educate people to direct democracy, to institutionalize democracy from below, organized in the confederal level, and abolish capitalism via municipalization of the economy. These were the main ideas. But no one was listening. I mean, the Marxists were not listening because they were Marxists. The anarchists and the anti-authoritarians were also not listening. They thought that this was too sectarian. For them, it was just, it will happen. We shouldn't make it serious. If you were trying to make it serious, then it sounded like Marxist. So immediately people were suspicious. So it was a dead end. The Marxists would be dismissive. All the people like the Occupy, I've been in several movements who were like Occupy, they were totally immediately suspicious. You have a line, so something is wrong. You're still like a Marxist. So, Marxism in a way insisted in this search for coherence and structured organization and all that. Okay, I'll just say what I remember. In 2007, when the crisis hit, I thought that this Marxist work, this Marxist analysis, this anonymous force of capital that behind our backs, that actually this is free and not us free, and this crisis made me want to rethink the Marxist critique and Marxist theory, but I wouldn't. I had, I didn't have any communication with all these schools I have left behind. So, how can I do it? How can I start reading Marxism, but not this old stuff that I have left behind? So it was Frankfurt School. I read, for example, Friedrich Pollock on state capitalism. I was trying to make sense of the crisis, but not going to this, ABC of Marxism that the Marxist organizations distribute. I was trying to figure it out on a heterodox, perhaps, level. So via Pollock, I got into Postone. I got his book. I read his book, but I liked his critique of capitalism. It sounded great. I mean, both Pollock and Postone is the possibility of a Marxist critique of Marxism. So being a Marxist, but criticizing all the crap Marxism. So this I became enthusiastic with this. And, but essentially, Postone's politics were for me similar with the ones that no one was interested in. I mean, they were anti-authoritarian. This is how I perceived it. Again, it's the democracy. So it fitted again with the anti-authoritarian perspective, and also other things of my background. Booksin has these notions of post-scarcity, and Postone was also that the 60s were somehow special because there were new possibilities. I don't know how to produce things, and this was some of the part that I didn't think that it was serious in what I was doing. It was not seriously involved in politics. So yeah, Postone, he was great, and I still think that he's great. I mean, his book is fantastic. But if you want to do something with it, then it leads to anti-authoritarianism or something. This is how I get it. So, Postone, I was reading the book and essays, and I got into this British blog, Principia or Principia Dialectica, because they have essays of Postone there, collections of essays. And
That was exactly what brought him to Barbara.
That's what brought him to.
Okay, I was reading in this blog, and that guy was, it was one guy that was making some very interesting comments, and his name was Chris Cutrone. And there were some crazy discussions about cross-stand and Bolsheviks and all that. And I got really attracted in this. And I liked the way Chris was discussing this because, you know, Platypus is interesting because for Platypus, anarchists are not just crap or bullshit. No, Platypus really likes to challenge the present and really likes to take the present serious. So, yeah, what I liked about Chris' comments was, I guess, something like this, that it's not that I know everything. I just, I seek for development, so to speak, via discussion. And yeah, so I sent him an email and we had a few discussions. I sent him some materials and he sent me back. And then I also was reading at that period courses, Marxism and Philosophy, which was for me fantastic because again it was this Marxism from a historical perspective, what we would say not a fixed relation of theory and praxis. So this was very relevant. I have read him in the past, but in the same book there were his other essays from the other years, and I was really confused with course because, but okay, no, this is.
He renounces himself.
Yeah, he renounces himself. So okay, and then I just started to reading the material of Platypus, watching the activities and following the activities, and I kind of liked it because I don't think that any Sunday is good for evolution or like any Sunday. So also not any Sunday is good for being something like Adorno or something. One has to think about this stuff and not take them for granted. And in an impasse, in the impasse that we were in Greece, and I was myself, I thought that we should challenge that deep our preconceptions and preconditions. So there is a necessity in this. It's like people are dragging by inertia to what they're doing. It's not working, but they do it for various reasons, but not for reasons of historical consciousness. Because it's a set of principles that they think it's correct, or because this is what some people told them that it's correct. So this was anti-Marxist for me. This was not dialectical for me. So and I ended up thinking that if Marx, Engels, Lenin, Adorno were living with us, what they would do. And I thought that it would be very probable that they would join Platypus. Because they were really interested in the problem of historical consciousness. Like we live in a society that is already free in a way, that it's already a society that is transforming, but we have to be conscious of this transformation to facilitate it. It's not that there were people who were saying that, okay, this is an eternal truth and I will impose it on society. So this spirit, I think, is embodied in Platypus like nothing else. So in an unpolitical era, Platypus is a way to save the possibility for politics, to try to do that, at least. And what else? I don't know. I just skipped everything and I just said it. So I think I will stop here and we can discuss.
Yeah.
Okay. So, in the next 15 minutes, I will attempt to provide a straightforward account of my political trajectory, which led to my joining Platypus sometime last summer. I will attempt to spell out my reasons for making this choice to the extent that they are not evident from the narrative itself. Because this story spans over approximately 10 years, it will necessarily be much abbreviated with many details omitted, but with that said, I shall proceed. My first encounter with radical left politics came when I was 13 years old, just a few months after the 9/11 attacks, but not directly provoked by them. Indeed, the first few months following September 11th, 2001, provide me with some of my only memories of a political consciousness not inflected through some variety of left politics. I remember proudly putting up American flags and hoping that Bush would get the bad guys in Afghanistan. It was only by coincidence that around this time a friend introduced me to the music of Rage Against the Machine. I became a fan and at some point received as a gift from my mother a DVD of the band in concert with special features that included a reading list, an interview with Noam Chomsky, and a mini documentary about the Zapatista movement. It was Chomsky above all that captured my imagination. I began to read his work and was genuinely outraged by the seemingly endless catalog of atrocities committed by the United States. I felt like I had been lied to my whole life, and mainstream sources of information were no longer to be trusted. Chomsky, on the other hand, seemed able to explain everything, and I adopted his worldview wholesale. The basic problem in the world was the existence of hierarchies. Capitalists had power over workers, governments had power over people. The solution was to abolish government, seize control of the means of production, and have all decisions made through democratic workers' councils. The main obstacle to this was, of course, the manipulation of the public mind through the corporate media. If only people could be woken up to all the horrible hierarchies in the world, they would rise up in the name of justice and create an egalitarian society. It was all quite naive in retrospect, but exposure to the idea that human freedom required the abolition of capitalism, however understood, is something I cannot regret, and from then on, working towards this end seemed like the only thing worth doing. At age 14, I started attending anti-war rallies, and there was introduced to the standard array of organizations and activities that one encounters on the left. I found it all infinitely fascinating, buying copies of all the sectarian newspapers, taking every flyer I was handed, and often attending the events they advertised. The anti-war movement introduced me to other activist causes, and I went to demonstrations to free Mumia Abu-Jamal, to free Palestine, to close the School of the Americas, to stop police brutality, and more. I attended teach-ins and lectures and was in and out of a few organizations, most consistently a youth and student anti-war group called Youth Power, Power being spelled P-A-W-R, and an acronym for Philadelphia Area War Resistance. One could say I shopped around the left, but any political differences there were seemed largely eclipsed by the unity created around trying to prevent the war. When the war came anyway, it drove me into a rage. As I saw it through the lens of the anti-war movement, the United States was carrying out a mass slaughter in order to steal oil and defying the will of its own population to do so. Protesting seemed inadequate, and I began to entertain fantasies about guerrilla warfare, becoming sympathetic to groups that had gone in such directions in the past, such as the Weather Underground. I would find other young people that sympathized with these fantasies in the next organization I joined, which remains the central involvement of my activist career. This was a nonprofit organization that did youth organizing in the Philadelphia public school system, to which I was recruited during my sophomore year of high school. The organization was best known for its role in the mostly successful campaign to prevent the privatization of the school district a few years prior, and it ran ongoing campaigns around funding equity and teacher quality, as well as several smaller campaigns based in particular schools. While this organization had no official ideology, there were some general ideas in circulation. Perhaps the general atmosphere could be best described as Saul Alinsky and Paulo Freire, draped in black nationalism and third worldism, with an occasional touch of Boggsianism. Yeah, James Boggs, Grace Lee Boggs. The Black Panther Party was held up as the model to which we should aspire, and it was common practice to begin meetings with a quote from Huey Newton, Malcolm X, or Che Guevara. Our assistant director was a former member of the Black Panther Party who, if he agreed with something you said, would call out the phrase, "Ready for the revolution." Every Saturday, citywide political education meetings were held at our downtown office. Students might be taught about the relationship between the decline of public education and structural shifts in the economy. They might debate whether it was racism or capitalism that was at the root of the conditions under which they lived. They might be asked to imagine what schools would be like in a liberated society. They might explore the impact on their lives of sexism or homophobia. I began to think of myself as an organizer rather than an activist. Instead of venting my anger in the streets, I was part of an organization that brought together as yet unpoliticized public school students to think about what might be done about the problems that affected them. It was around this period that I underwent two important ideological shifts. First, I began to consider myself a Marxist of some kind rather than an anarchist. This was the result of a conversation with a new communist movement veteran that I had met doing anti-war work, in which I was successfully convinced that Chomsky's approach to revolutionary politics was unserious, and any large-scale social transformation would necessarily involve leadership, collective discipline, and a struggle for power. Yet my Marxism didn't extend much beyond this. Thus, I also soon accepted the idea that anarchists were merely petty bourgeois individualists who placed too much importance on their precious bourgeois freedoms because they hadn't experienced deprivation. Retrospectively, some of this was frightening stuff. My second shift, even more frightening, was towards identity politics, and was the result of an anti-racism training orchestrated by a group called the People's Institute for Survival and Beyond. The training began with a list of ground rules that included a prohibition on discussions of class and on bringing up examples from outside the United States. Racism was defined as prejudice plus power, and from this it was concluded that only white people could be racist, all white people were racist, and spreading this message to other white people was the only acceptable form of political action for white people. I admit that I drank the Kool-Aid, but this was enabled by the fact that the older organizers I respected seemed to have no fundamental disagreements with the line being put forward. I wanted to oppose racism and was told this was the only way to do it. Soon after this training, identitarianism and Stalinized Marxism converged when I was introduced to the book Settlers, The Mythology of the White Proletariat by J. Sakai. Sakai provided a theoretical basis for precisely the kind of ideology with which I was being inculcated and thus held great appeal. The practical results of this thinking were soon to play out in two organizations with which I was involved, with predictably disastrous results. The membership of the youth organizing outfit for which I worked began a concerted effort to oust the executive director on the grounds that he was white and therefore not representative of the constituency with which the organization worked. The call for a change in leadership was probably justified, but the manner in which it was pursued was calamitous and led to a shutdown of the organization. More ridiculously, the Student Environmental Action Coalition, with which I was less involved, made a decision after undergoing an anti-racism training to adopt a permanently segregated organizational structure. Much chaos ensued, and after a meeting at which someone proposed that the organization give up its office because perhaps having an office was simply, quote, a white Anglo-Saxon model of organizing, I decided I had had enough.
Well, it is. What's good about it?
Thanks to these experiences, I arrived at college already somewhat critical of identity politics, but very politically disoriented. I sought out the campus radicals and found them in the Student Labor Action Movement, or SLAM. As it was explained to me by the most prominent activist on campus, an anarchist, SLAM was a revolutionary organization that was working to forge alliances between students and workers in the struggle against capitalism. A better description would have been that SLAM did public relations work for the SEIU bureaucracy. But I wasn't aware of this at the time, having no background in the politics of organized labor. Thus, I immersed myself in the activities of the organization, publicizing union rallies, circulating petitions, meeting with administrators, the usual duties of activism. During the first semester, we helped the security guards form a union via card check procedure. At the end of the second semester, the guards were negotiating their first contract. SLAM decided the best way to support the guards' demands for a living wage was to launch a hunger strike, in which I participated, and for which I was interviewed by Amy Goodman on Democracy Now! The hunger strike lasted 9 days and resulted in a wage increase of $3 an hour, which we considered a success. However, when I returned to Philadelphia that summer, I learned something that made me change my opinion. Apparently, SEIU had agreed to stop organizing security guards in Philadelphia, where they were making only $9 an hour, in exchange for negotiating leverage in Boston. Apparently, our labor solidarity work was much less radical than we thought it was. When the next school year began, I raised this at a SLAM meeting, but found almost no one interested. Of course, SEIU sucks, they said, but we still have to support the workers however we can. Only one other person seemed to be deeply troubled by this, but lacking sympathy from the rest of the group, he dropped out of activism and spent the remainder of college experimenting with psychedelic drugs. I personally remained involved because I received a grant that paid me $10 an hour to do public service, which SLAM could be passed off as. However, after that point, I ceased to have much real investment in the organization. I became known as something of a curmudgeon on the campus left, perpetually dissatisfied with the activities of the activist organizations, but still hanging around for some reason. The remainder of my college career was politically rather uneventful, despite including my participation in the founding of the Harvard chapter of New SDS, which was basically a stillborn enterprise. However, the most significant event for me in this period was not anything happening in the activist world, but rather that I read the book Class Notes by Adolph Reed. He seemed to put into words everything I had experienced on the left over the past 10 years. I took many lessons from his work, but the main point for me was about consciousness, namely that oppressed people didn't already have all the answers by virtue of being oppressed, and that the left didn't have the answers by virtue of its self-conception as being in opposition to the powerful. Reed inspired me to take ideas more seriously. I devoted the summer following my college graduation to reading Volume 1 of Capital, and my worldview was never the same again. While still completely alienated from activism, I became convinced of the fundamental correctness of Marx's critique. This situation made me very susceptible to joining Platypus. I first encountered Platypus at last year's Left Forum when I confusedly stumbled into a panel on Lukács, which at the time I admit I couldn't understand a word of. However, I saw platypus1917.org written on the chalkboard and jotted it down. A few days later, I visited the website and was enthralled by what I found. I needed no convincing that the left was dead, but Platypus was able to explain the death of the left in a new way. It wasn't just a matter of ineffective organizations unable to mobilize large numbers of people to win victories. It was a matter of thought and historical consciousness, of the scaling back of emancipatory aspirations as a result of defeat. Previously, I had believed the death of the left occurred sometime in the 1970s with the rise of identity politics. Platypus put the legacy of the new left of the 1960s and old left of the 1930s on the table for critical re-examination, both of which I had previously taken for granted as high watermarks of left activity to which we should be seeking a return. I began attending the reading group in Philadelphia, and a few weeks later became a member of the organization. So, why did I join Platypus? The basic reasons were as follows. First, because it was clear to me that existing forms of left politics were not only inadequate to the task of abolishing capitalism, but were unconcerned with overcoming their inadequacy or had abandoned the goal itself. Platypus sought to provoke recognition of this fact. Second, because I felt that the Platypus Reading Group offered the best way to learn about Marxism that I had encountered on my years on the left, and wanted to encourage the participation of as many sympathetic people as possible in this activity. I found the education invaluable, not just in its own right, but as a way of coming to understand the politics in which I had been involved as an activist. And third, because I wanted the freedom to think about left politics for myself without being subject to the thought taboos of organizations concerned only with justifying their own pragmatic activities or with glorifying a past with which they sought to claim continuity. Platypus seemed to offer such an opportunity. And this is why I joined Platypus. Thank you.
Okay, so thanks everyone. Thanks to Chris, I guess, for organizing this.
I guess my thoughts are a bit scattered. I don't know if that's just because it's the day after the party or what, but so I guess my politicization begins 2008, which is not that long ago. I mean, I was politicized after Obama won the election, so it's sort of, I feel young.
But my political involvement was basically on campus at Stony Brook, right? So before Platypus, that is. So it's kind of isolated there. There's not many people. But most of the people I was involved with came from, say, like Laurie's kind of not generation, but you know what I mean. This sort of SDS type.
Yes, and the organized people.
Yeah, and so working with them, like we tried to do a lot of stuff. So we tried to organize this movement to, you know, stop the cuts. We were going to have a paper. We organized a few reading groups. But it was like I was at the sort of front, involved really heavily doing all that. And I felt like almost all the time just totally dissatisfied with what we were doing. It was so for example, with the paper I wanted to call it internationalist, and it ended up being called the third wheel, something like that. And so I was like, why the hell am I even working with these people? I was all the time looking for other people on the campus to work with, and there's just nobody there, right? So I guess when you said you were sort of known as the curmudgeon on the campus left, yeah, it was the same for me. I mean, people just didn't like me, I think. I mean, I don't care. I mean, fuck that. No, but so just it's kind of like personal intellectual history and my history of involvement on the left are intertwined in this weird way, right? Especially because I still have to decide what I'm going to do with my career and all that stuff and my sort of intellectual pursuits, and which on this point one of the things that really drew me to Platypus was this way to think about postmodernism and what's going on in academia, because I came on it sort of. Well, I should start by saying, like, to grow up politically today, it's a bit like finding yourself, I don't know, in like Neverland. It's kind of like, what the hell is going on? What happened? It sucks. Like I would rather live at some other, or have lived at some other time, I think. But so I don't know, this understanding, trying to understand all these professors, et cetera, sort of like what they're doing. I mean, there's this guy that I hang around with now. You know, we were talking about my involvement with Platypus, and he referred to all the Marxists as the cowboys. And it's like, all right, fine. I mean, he's really sympathetic to everything, but I mean, what are you doing? Like, it's just, I don't.
What's meant by cowboys?
I guess just like. Is it against Indians or?
No, just like he means it like radical, not literally, but he means radicals. But it was this way he said it that it seemed like he's totally in agreement with everything. It's just that he doesn't want to do it, right? It's like he doesn't see the reason to do it.
Not ready to saddle up.
Right.
What'd you say, Watson?
We go around and we shoot up the place. We have disagreements with everybody.
Oh, well, yeah, I don't think he was talking about Platypus specifically, but just the radicals. So yeah, I mean, and actually, Ben, I hope you don't mind me talking about our conversation yesterday, but I mean,
always on the record. Always on the record, comrade.
But I mean, Ben said if I found myself in America, what would I do? I would leave.
It was joking.
Yeah. No.
Wait, haven't you found yourself in America?
There's an element of truth in
Are you finally?
I've actually lost my passport. I had to stay in Chicago for a while, but not that long.
Right.
No, so that's sort of like my history with my involvement, and so at the same time this is all going on, I'm trying to figure things out, reading different things. What really got me thinking about politics first wasn't anything to do with the world, or it was atheism and the new humanist stuff, which I kind of liked. This sort of radical, to hell with religion stuff I thought it was great. And but then, reading about it and all this stuff, like getting the limits getting to its limits and being dissatisfied with it, sort of made the leap into politics and or just even getting bored with it. And so that's when I started reading all about Marxism. I never really was or like interested in anarchism, I think. I mean, a lot of people were. I guess one what would you call it, a symptom, a good story maybe is on the campus when we were organizing all these things. One thing that really it kept coming up again and again is this thing, we don't want to be organized, this in this like hierarchical way, like because that's just Stalinism or something like that. And there was one other guy together. We were like, this is just bullshit. Like, what are people talking about? Like, this is Stalinism? Not really. It's just the fact that people don't understand what happened on the left before. It's sort of, you have these intimations of, there's something back there, and we have to go find out what it was. And so this friend that I'm talking about, he ended up joining the OFS, and he hangs around with that crew. And I still think he's a comrade. I like him, but
Organization for a Free Society. It's a sort of splinter of the new SDS.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and they're kind of close with the ISO.
Yeah.
So what else? I had this experience with the group called NYSER, the New York Students Rising. They had a retreat in Albany, which was fun. So I got there, I drove up when I got there sort of like at the end of the first day, so I missed the whole day, and all there was really to do was sit around and talk with people, and so I ended up getting kind of hammered, and we were talking with this guy who had this theory about that some tribe back in Africa, a few thousand years ago had already discovered quantum mechanics. I was like, what the fuck is this? Like, you're insane. Don't you realize that? And he was seriously arguing it. And no, it's just like I guess what I'm trying to say is that the question why I joined Platypus is also the question why I keep hanging around. It's sort of this reproductive way of thinking about it. And so it's like you.
The left.
What?
Hang around the left.
No, hang around Platypus. Why I joined, I mean, it's like, why I joined Platypus, it's the same question as why I still stay with, like, why be involved anyway, right? And like one of the reasons, I suppose, would be that once you get into this way of thinking about symptoms, you find them everywhere, and you keep finding them, and they keep coming up, and at least we can think about it. So,
what else? What do I want to say? I had some stuff here.
With the 60s, the 60s generation, Chris, you mentioned this, that was the other thing. I totally unhappy with the 60s generation, right? We talked about this a lot this weekend, or at least I did maybe. But encountering these people, it feels like what they're doing is the same old thing. Yeah, that's sort of trivial to say, I guess, but they're not that interested. I mean, interesting to me. Like with this guy you mentioned, that he's sort of sycophantic to his elders, to the 60s generation. Yeah, it's to find them uninteresting, I think, is kind of like good. I don't know what to say. It's like what do they really have to say? I find somebody like Paul Berman to be more interesting than somebody, some old SDS guy,
Yeah, they're the same.
Yeah.
No, but somebody who's still sort of, considers themselves. Well, I guess Paul Berman does too. But somebody who's not, didn't make a break at some point, right? Yeah, so I mean, I guess I'll leave it with that. I'd rather hear what the questions are.
Indeed. Let's stack this a bit. Ed and then Richard.
So I guess this is mainly directed at Chris. But in my own experience, before I joined Platypus, I guess the major other Marxist organization that tried to recruit me was the League of Revolutionaries for New America. And their founder, as some of you know, is extremely old. He experienced the 30s left, the Cold War left, the New Left, all of that. And I think one of the arguments used in support of joining that organization was his historical experience. But I joined Platypus not on the basis of that, but more on the basis of agreeing with the correctness of the assessment of the present. So I'm wondering, how do you grapple with that? What does that historical experience count for? And especially insofar as it's used to sort of make a certain claim to authority, whereas I actually don't think that really necessarily is any claim to authority. I think a claim on the basis of the correctness or the incorrectness of a political approach to the present is what drew me to the organization and sort of why I remain.
Right. I mean, I guess I should say something. I mean, I started my opening remarks before Richard arrived, even though, Richard is a character in that story. And so he can sort of speak for himself. He doesn't have to be narrated by me. But, why we chose, why Richard suggested, but at least to some degree, but also why I found it appropriate, this idea of the platypus, was a sense of, and I think that this was already mentioned, a kind of, well, in fact, Doug, you mentioned in terms of a sense of dislocation from the present, dislocation in time. And, I think that, if Richard and I were to describe ourselves in terms of being of like an 80s vintage, right, we would say that, it's like in Darwinian terms, we're the survival of that mass extinction. Namely, the question would be, how come no one else who lived through that period, learned the lessons of that period in precisely the way that we did? It's a curious question. And so the claim to authority is peculiar and also kind of negative. And I think that's where the affinity with Adorno comes in. Namely that it's the experience of experiencing something and also learning something that no one else seemed to have experienced or learned, even though they could very plausibly have done so. Right? That's a kind of a peculiar kind of experience. In other words, it's not that Richard and I can make any great claims to being exemplary activists of our time or something like that, even though Richard is a little bit of a Forrest Gump kind of figure in terms of leftism. He has been at all of these places and at all of these moments in a way that he always has an anecdote to tell that throws me back on my heels. And in fact, Richard does have, in some ways, more of a continuous activist background than I do. I literally took almost 10 years off from the left, completely, if not a little bit longer than that, actually. Yeah, between 1992, more than 10 years I took completely off from the left in a way that Richard stayed involved. But, so the claim would be something like a negative claim about historical experience. Namely, what kind of a critique of the present does history provide? Which is different from the idea of like building on the past, In other words, it's not, a positive lesson from the past that carries forward, but rather a negative lesson from the past that carries forward. And it cuts to a kind of something that both Theo and Ben mentioned about historical consciousness. And I should mention also Adolph Reed. That's another kind of funny affinity contact there, is that Adolph Reed's one of my mentors from college, even though he didn't teach at Hampshire College. I went to school with his son, and he was teaching at Yale when I was at Hampshire. And I wrote him, because he wrote an op-ed about black student protest, campus takeovers, and I wrote Adolph, and he's like, well, my son's going to school with you. And he had friends up there. And anyway, Adolf is a central figure for us. And I had a little story that I skipped in my opening remarks, which is that Adolf was invited by some of my other professors at Hampshire to give a talk at Hampshire. And I was in a class at the time on the history of Marxism. And the day after Adolf's talk, students in the class asked his friends who had invited him to speak at Hampshire, they said, why would a black American in the late 20th century be interested in a German Jewish philosopher from the 19th century, namely Marx? And my professors, who were of course Adolf's friends and who were Marxists, but who were white people, they said, that's a good question. And I thought, that is the fucking worst question I've ever heard in my life. Right? Who knows, maybe Margaret, my professor, maybe she meant something more ironical by saying that's a good question. But anyway, getting back to it, the sort of negative historical consciousness. In other words, which goes to the question of historical consciousness and regression. Namely that, what is it, the Benjamin phrase, and there was a Benjamin phrase and an Adorno phrase. The Benjamin phrase is from, he took it from one of his conversations with Brecht, that we shouldn't start with the good old days, but rather with the bad new ones, right? That you start with not with the good old days, but with the bad new ones. And Adorno has a phrase in one of his essays that the new is the old in distress. The new is the old in distress. And what that means is that, Richard and I, the claim that we would make is that we can be aware of history repeating itself. Right?
The struggle doesn't continue.
The struggle doesn't continue. The history repeats itself in the sense that the left dies again and again. Right? In other words, what we lived through was not a living left of the 80s, but rather a dead left of the 80s. And that dead left gets reanimated. It gets reanimated in the 90s with Seattle. It gets reanimated with the anti-war movement in the 2000s. It gets reanimated again with Occupy. And so it's a peculiar kind of claim to historical experience. It's a negative claim. It's not a positive claim. The negative claim is that we've seen this before. We've seen that it doesn't work, rather than we know what struggle is from our past and we want to transmit that struggle into the future. What we want to do is stop the struggle from continuing because it doesn't really continue anyway.
May I answer the question briefly? First of all, I would say that the central political event, I had this sort of liberal upbringing, and I had a kind of Chomskyite sort of vague new leftist critical perspective when I got to college. But what really radicalized me was paradoxically the collapse of Stalinism. And so the collapse of Stalinism actually pushed me into Trotskyism, to which I'd hitherto been resistant, which is a paradox because it meant that what was fundamentally a huge defeat for the left, the restoration of capitalism, pushed me to a more radical perspective politically. That was a very unusual perspective on the period 1989 to 1992. And it therefore gave me an unusual perspective on Trotskyism and the whole Trotskyist tradition, which I shared with Chris. And therefore, our attitude towards the Spartacus League was, I think, always somewhat angular, although Chris came from a somewhat different political trajectory. But we ended up in sort of very remarkably the same place. The other thing I want to say is that I actually had considerable contact with people of the 30s generation. Most of my friends are either liberals or people with what I would call bad Bradley politics. A lot of the people I was hanging out with in Hampshire, people in the Palestine Solidarity Committee, people whose politics I really didn't share, but I had some personal interaction, and they were nice people, and I kind of had a schizophrenic attitude towards what I fully thought of their politics. The person whom I was closest to personally as a friend, other than Chris, and I had some political affiliation with, was a man who, if he were still alive, would be over 100, and whose politicization took place in the 1920s, and who lived into his 90s. and had been a member of the Communist League of America, founder of the Socialist Workers' Party, etc. And through him, I met like a whole bunch of people his age, even some people older. I met someone who'd been Trotsky's bodyguard. I met someone who actually was living in Russia at the time in 1917 and remembered the revolution. And as a teenager, and one of the things I experienced, just at a kind of subjective level, was a sense that that generation of radicals were much more psychologically serious than the 60s generation. That they actually believed much more deeply in the possibility of an actual revolution. And there was a kind of break from the period of the 30s to the period of the 60s, which was fundamentally negative in the subjective experience of radicals, that has further deepened, but has become manifest as a fundamental epistemological, psychological break. And I was very struck by that. I felt that I was getting the last gasp of a really different sensibility. Now those people failed. And one of their failures was that those people, like my friend David, who were in the Socialist Workers' Party, did not correct the problem of the 60s. That either they had a cranky sort of neocon attitude towards the 60s, or people like David, they embraced the 60s as a renewal of radicalism and didn't actually act in a sufficiently critical attitude towards the young radicals that they were recruiting, but rather followed their lead. And that's a great deal of the tragedy of the New Left, that the older generation of radicals who were not more educated to the New Left. But I had some questions for the panel, which I wanted to direct. One question is specifically for Ben, which is that you spoke about your campus experience, but of course you went to the most elite school in the Western Hemisphere, perhaps the world.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just sort of curious how, coming from your political background, you experienced specifically being at Harvard, and how that played into your political imagination. And the question for all of the panelists is, what was your family background politically? Like, what kind of political ideas did you get from your family?
Okay, I could start. I mean, I guess coming to Harvard from the political background I was coming from, I sort of had a sense of being surrounded by the class enemy all the time in a way that often wasn't psychologically healthy. And I mean, a lot of the personalities I ran into there were genuinely distasteful people. But yeah, I don't know. I mean, the left there felt unconnected from, I want to say unconnected from actual people's struggles, as if that's the hallmark of something. But there is still some sort of difference between activists who only talk to other activists and activists who try to talk to people who aren't political about their politics. Having to talk to people who aren't political about politics is a sort of experience that I think is very important in a lot of ways. I don't know if that fully addresses the question about Harvard, but about my family political background. My father is a registered Republican, and not very political, but I mean he had sort of new leftish sympathies in the 60s. He was strongly opposed to the Vietnam War, for instance, and still reveres JFK as the greatest hero in the history of the world. But somewhere along the way became a Republican. I mean, it seems to be largely motivated by anti-black racism, actually. And my mother was a sort of liberal Democrat, hippie type, not very political, but had a sort of general interest in we should all be working to make the world a better place, sort of thing. So I guess that would be my political upbringing in my family.
I wanted to say something about background. It's a kind of a curious thing. because I think that Richard might be thinking along these lines, which is, I'm always struck by the degree to which the left is comprised of red diaper babies. And one thing that's unique about Platypus is just how none of us are red diaper babies. My family, working class background, very reactionary family background. These are fascist fodder type people. My brother's a cop. My mother is a nurse. She's working class, but she works at the county hospital, and this just instills a kind of antisocial attitude. That she deals with the public. My brother and my mother deal with the public, and that makes them very cynical about people because they deal with working class people and makes them very cynical. And my father is like low-level management, restaurant manager, and then now manages a food service at a nursing home. And was a waiter for many years. And so definitely petty bourgeois run amok, or like right-wing white working class. Although my brother and my mother will vote Democrat sometimes. They will. They're not like solid Republican in any way. But the point being that it goes to sensibility. It goes to sensibility. Because so much of the left is generational and is red diaper baby and is a subculture and is steeped in a kind of ethical posture with respect to society. What's struck me always about Platypus since we started is the degree to which we don't follow that pattern, and I always consider it to be a hallmark of the seriousness of our project, in fact, that's the case. But anyway, I just wanted to say that about my background.
I think we have pretty similar background. I mean, white working class, petty bourgeois from Long Island. I mean, it's like, and my family, it's, they vote Democrat, but maybe one comment my dad made would be revealing is that I asked him, "Oh, why did you vote for Bush?" And he said something like, "Oh, that's who you were supposed to vote for." And I was like, "Oh, all right, if that's the case." I mean, but
Truth or attorney?
Yeah, but I mean, just in terms of the general sensibility, I guess they're Irish Italian, so there's like a mild racism, mild kind of anti-Semitism. Like there's actually a good conversation between Christopher Hitchens and Martin Amis on Saul Bellow, and Martin Amis is talking about Kingsley Amis, and he's saying this sort of mild racism, and it's like at the end of a movie with the credits, so the credits are going up, and you see there's like lots of Jews, and he says, Kingsley Amis goes, "Oh yeah, there's another one," or something like that, It's just like, it's not, it's really hard to explain, because it's not like thematic kind of racism, it's just, I don't know, like a kind of, it's an expression of difference, but it's not nasty or anything like that. It's just whatever. I mean, of course, I think they're idiots for it, goes without saying, but...
it's like a mild antisocial attitude.
Right, yeah.
Yeah. Yep.
And of course, it doesn't really make them bad people, it's just what is. But yeah, that's all I would say.
Yeah, my parents too are right wing, but now with the crisis, I don't know. Maybe my mother, she will vote for the left. I don't know. She's thinking about it to vote for the left. I don't know what she will find. The elections are coming. Also, my older brothers were indifferent to politics. The one was the literature guy, the other was the math genius guy. So I really hadn't. But some relatives from my mother's side were communists, and actually one was in exile during the military junta. So there were some relationship, perhaps, from this side. Yeah, it's.
Other questions? Ed's got a second question. Jeremy?
So I guess kind of the stories that were told so far were sort of up to the moment of joining, so I wonder if you could give like
condensed summaries of like since this includes Chris, everyone in the panel. Just sort of the key ways in which joining the group then based on what had happened, why you joined the group, the key ways in which you've changed or grown, or what work you've done and how it's mattered. Condensed version.
Can I add something that I think is important from the previous question? My father was a right wing, but not because of ideological reasons, because he saw socialist statism in action, not working in the 80s with the National Socialistic movement. So he was very critical of this collectivist socialism because he had seen it practically transforming to its opposite. So he was always like, if it worked, I would be with it.
Mm-hmm.
But it never worked. So I just wanted to add that.
No, that's a good point, because it is like the neoliberalism. There are different forms of right-wingism. Yeah. But Jeremy's question.
So who wants to start on that? Should I go?
Doug?
What was the question again?
The condensed version of
Oh, right.
You talked about why you joined. So
Yeah, right. I mean, that's kind of when I said that why I joined is also the question why I keep hanging around. I mean, like I've been in and out for maybe over a year, right? So I think like the organization, I'm happy with the way the organization is going, in terms of development. And like Richard, we were talking last night about the difference between this convention and the last one. And actually even to see people like Mike Eli, the difference in his presentations this year versus last year, and like sort of the way things change. And I don't know what I should say. I mean, like, what are you looking for in your question? I mean, you're always looking for something in a question.
That sounds like an anti-Semitic
There's
remark.
always.
How have you changed? I think it's like, how has this changed what you've done?
In what ways is Platypus different than what you thought it was going to be or not?
No, it wasn't different. It's sort of everything I thought it would be, which is the thing, right? No, like I'm really happy with it. That's why it's, keep sticking around. So I guess that's it.
I can say one thing about this. In terms
I'm
of,
very disappointed in Platypus.
Look,
It feels
I'll,
completely different.
Chris Cutrone, who loves it.
I'll be talking about this in the organization meeting this afternoon. But I'm the glass half empty guy in Platypus. Meaning we could always be doing better. I think. But at the same time, if I had to think about it in terms of history, like a thematic that we've been talking about, I would say, 5 years in, this has been dense time. In some ways it's 5 years, it's a long time. No, it's 5 years is short time, I'm 41 years old. 5 years isn't very long at all. And what I can say is that 5 years, this is, the densest 5 years of my life as a result of Platypus. Dense in terms of personal development, dense in terms of activity. It's been an intense time. And so, a theme that I'm going to raise later, not in the public president's report, but the organizational president's report, is, learning process, structured learning experience. I feel like I've learned more in the last 5 years than in any other comparable amount of time in my life. Maybe college, maybe, but even that feels like a kind of a looser time than the last 5 years. So I just want to sort of say that. And I think that one of the things that we aim at with historical consciousness as a thematic is, in fact, that our activity is meant to objectify history. Right? So one of the things that we've talked about recently is how we've lived through at least 3 different historical phases in the last 5 years. right? The anti-war movement, the Obama election and economic crisis, and now Occupy. In a lot of ways, we're probably one of the few organizations on the left that would think of it that way. In other words, would think of the last 5 years as actually being demarcatable into 3 different phases. The rest of the left would say, oh, it's just more of the same, more of the same, more of the same. They wouldn't have this sense of the density of time of 5 years that we have. And that's testament to the project as well.
I would say I've gained a tremendous amount in the past year in terms of my own education, primarily through participating in the reading group and talking to more senior members of Platypus about ideas, reading things they recommended, having a lot of free time to do other readings to supplement what we were reading in the reading group. I mean, the being introduced to like radical bourgeois philosophy, a lot of those things were things I'd never read before. This was like an incredible experience for me. Also, the work of Moishe Paston, the history of Trotskyism, and I subscribe to the Workers' Vanguard now. I would have never been able to understand why that was like actually an interesting newspaper to read before I joined Platypus. So I would say that's been the effect that participating in Platypus has had on me.
Yeah, it was like a small renaissance for me too. Personally, intellectually, politically, yeah, and also in my environment. I think that something productive is going on, intersecting the left, small step by step, making a small impact. So until now, yeah, I think it's very productive for me on all levels. Among all the catastrophes, it's something.
While Greece burns.
The Thessaloniki Reading Group soldiers on. All right, Ed, and then we'll wrap, since we started about a half an hour late, and we're going. Oh, there was? Oh, Adoni. All right, Adoni and then Ed. Adoni, go ahead.
It strikes me in some of these stories, there's something that happens when you're coming into Platypus or sort of making that decision. It's really of disorientation. And one thing I think of is like crankiness, like this thing where you start fighting with everybody. That I think I worked through. It was very painful. I just wanted to kind of think about how that, if you're experiencing that transition, or like what it's. Because I got a sense from both of you that you identified, you started to take on this character on campus as like the grumpy contrarian.
Yeah, but I think it has to do with, I mean, continue, but it's, because so much of left organizing turns into this cliquish kind of stuff where it's like a subculture. And so to be interested in, actually trying to change the world is, it's even taboo in a way. It's like, for them, it's just, oh yeah, we do this social justice stuff, blah, blah, blah. But it's not, like, they don't think hard about it. And when somebody else does, it's kind of like, oh, well, I guess you could say that, or, oh, I guess you could do that, but we're not really interested. It's kind of, and so, yeah.
Well, the other thing that seemed to come up was like some kind of attempt to make, I mean, I did this. I mean, I got more, when I was first coming into Platypus, I almost got more deeply involved with social democracy. Because I wanted to get more serious. The lesson was that the new left wasn't serious, so I was going to get more serious. So I had this very kind of like disorienting path, and as I was sort of like approaching Platypus, and I just was kind of curious if you had, you could speak to that more.
I think, do you want to speak?
Well, I mean, so like in my cranky period between like being alienated from activism and joining Platypus, like one thing I did was I became very attracted to like Adolf Reed, who's very cranky, and also Christopher Hitchens, and then like reading a lot of Christopher Hitchens made me like see what made it much easier for me to understand what Platypus was saying about the Iraqi anti-war movement. I think one of the challenges for me in Platypus has been figuring out how to like shed my crankiness and actually like talk to other people about these ideas and interest them in, and not just be like come off as sort of cranky. It's like, it's really been a personal challenge, and it's something I'd still like to improve on.
Because it's like you can't in good faith organize with these people, right? That's the way I feel.
Which people?
The left.
Just the regular left kind of activist types. So for campaigns against, like budget cuts or something like that.
Why not?
Why not?
Yeah.
I mean, because you don't. At least I don't feel like it's not how we're gonna end up, changing the world. It's just I don't feel it's adequate to the task. There's nothing beyond it, right? So it's this, I guess, NGO kind of stuff.
Oh, I just wanted to say, so when you mean organize with them, you mean you can't get involved with their projects, or that you couldn't actually like host them on a panel? Like, what do you mean?
No, get involved in the projects.
Get involved in their project?
Yeah. Or build one with them.
I mean, activism, I can certainly speak to this from the 80s. Never wins. Never wins.
But I don't know where Nick is. He's not here. Nick is
I mean,
activist.
no, but the point would be it's not that I don't want to do it, it's just, or that I couldn't do it, it's that I couldn't do it completely in good faith.
Good faith.
And as soon as you start trying to tell people, oh yeah, maybe we should start thinking about strategy or things like this, or, or whatever, it's like they don't want to hear it.
I don't know, this was like the way in which in USDS, anyway, Lori and I would have a conversation that like people are activists, but they act on the world because they have an idea of what it is, and
Mhm.
like they have to justify their actions to themselves. And there's always like a dimension of like, self-doubt about what you're doing, and the thing was that in the USDS it was a bit taboo to like raise those questions because you're supposed to organize and act and do whatever. But I think that in conversations with some of the people that became solutions with in USDS and others, they're like Nick. There's a lot of fruitful ground there.
Yeah, certainly. Teo, are you still in the cranky phase? Past crankiness?
There's one more question.
Sleepless phase.
This is something to say about 80s activism. I don't regret being involved in ACT UP, honestly. Like, for instance, because I was living in Castro in San Francisco in the early 90s and had friends who were dying, and I was coming from basically what we would probably, I would be much more critical of it now, right? But a Marxist perspective, right? But and didn't really think that this was going to change the world, but there it was, and I think that has given me always like a kind of sympathy for reform movements. And my parents were Roosevelt Democrats, so I was both critical of them, but also praised by them to some extent, right? So it's but there are often reasons why people are desperate and engage in reform movements. That I think it's sometimes hard to see in the U.S. actually.
That's the other thing. It's peculiar.
Right.
It's peculiar. Ed, one last question.
Yeah, my question is, politically, what would you do if not Platypus? Chris, you mentioned that Parker felt that he had to engage the 60s left. I heard a rumor that one of our ex-members has joined a Maoist organization. Another last I heard wants to start like a cultural institution in the model of Black Mountain College or Bauhaus. So I'm wondering if, let's say hypothetically, for just some overriding personal reason, you were unable to participate in Platypus, have you been inoculated against the project of independent intellectualism or academic Marxism or sectarian Marxism? Would you be apolitical? What would you do, if anything?
Good question. Teo.
I think that I was ready to go home, and perhaps be concerned with intellectual issues, but not politically involved with anything. And Platypus was a reason to stay and engage again people publicly. Yeah, I don't know if that covers you. I try to speak about the reasons about that. Because one can be a revolutionary when no one hears him, no one is hearing him, and or one can be a reformist and not succeeding on anything. And I really thought that I should do something productive, and this is why I found Platypus productive.
I suppose I would try to develop myself as a writer and a speaker about Marxism and its history, largely based on ideas I've come to through Platypus, but I still think many of those ideas are the most important ideas to be talking to people about today, and I would try to find a way to do that through whatever I thought was the most productive channel possible. I can't really say what that would be.
I don't know if I would even be involved politically. I might go play golf or something like that. No, I would probably just hang around the left as it is, and do my own thing, just keeping like a angry, curmudgeonly person. Yeah. I mean, you see, like, there's this sense of, I don't know, like, responsibility. I don't really want to do politics, right? It's like it's something, it's like, I don't know, it's just, I just feel like you do it. It's something that calls you. And so if I didn't have to, it'd be kind of good, maybe. That's why, like, the insurrectionist guy yesterday. Yeah, like, for him, like, the world is whatever, this terrible place, and there's no possibility for anything. And so if that's the case, if there really is no possibility for, this project of emancipation, then why not just live? Or, go to the museum and things like that. That's the way I feel, at least.
Rosa Luxemburg said she would have raised chickens.
I mean, life doesn't suck that much, right?
Not yet.
Well, all right. I guess, and I guess this will be the last remark. I'll say this, right? So, steeped in the history of Marxism as I am, right, there are these figures. Right? There's Marx, there's Lenin, there's Trotsky, there's Adorno. I don't feel like I can do what they did. In other words, I don't think that I could have the historical optimism of a Marx or a Lenin or a Trotsky or a Luxemburg. In other words, Luxemburg's, scribbling her final article before she gets killed by the Freikorps. I was, I am, I shall be. No, right? I don't feel that way. Also about Adorno, writing messages in a bottle, addressee unknown. I don't think that's an option. The degree to which
is going to dry up.
The degree to which I consider myself to be a Marxist, I do feel like I'm the survivor of an extinct, in a sense already extinct species. That it's not a matter of transmission in that sense. There's no, addressee in the future, beyond this moment. Right? I do think it's the last chance. That within my own lifetime is the last possible opportunity for Marxism before it gets completely forgotten, because it's largely forgotten already. And not only that, but I think that in a sense, we might already be too late. And so, in that respect, failure of Platypus would mean something really profound existentially for me, because it wouldn't allow for the possibility of. I was reading Hal Draper, who's a founding person for the ISO United States. So the ISO has a kind of a mixed heritage, It has really a Hal Draper background, but then it also has a Tony Cliff background. And it's really a shame that the Tony Cliff background took over, because the Hal Draper background was a lot better. But Hal Draper quit the ISO. You know, he quit the ISO and he said, okay, I'm going to make my contributions as an independent intellectual. And what he did was essentially scholarly work on the history of Marxism, you know, curmudgeon till the end of his days, like, no, Lenin said this, not that, right? I don't know that I could do that either, you know, that I could, like, hold out, you know, no, Adorno really meant this. I don't think so. I don't think so, right? So I think of these various sort of figures, and, you know, Horkheimer, right? There's like Adorno, who's like the eternal child, writing messages in a bottle, right? Never resigning, right? Resignation. No, it's you, 60 kids who are harassing me. It's you who've resigned, not me. But, you know, Horkheimer resigned from the left. He resigned from Marxism. He became just a right-wing crank. You know, so I have all of these figures in my mind as potential outcomes. Platypus or bust? Platypus or bust? For me, anyway. All right. So that concludes this discussion. So we're very late now. We're an hour behind schedule because we